Brilliant.
Oh dear, we're recording now. Let's watch what we say. Let's get it all out now before everybody else joins.
Okay. It's still showing us offline on Pandora. Okay. There we go.
Sure.
Okay, and I could hear my mum in the other room.
Give her my best.
Okay, I'm going to close this because looking at myself is weird. Hello, residents of the realm, greetings and salutations, and welcome to God Save the Other Queen.
Not this one.
And here are my fabulous panelists. Let's go round and have everybody introduce yourselves, if you please, starting with the glorious and famous throughout the many realms, Miss Carrie Vaughan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Vaughan. I'm an author with a bunch of novels and short stories out. For this panel, I have written a series of steampunk short stories on Lightspeed magazine, the Harry and Marlowe stories that are set in an alternate Victorian England that has been changed by the introduction of alien technology.
Ooh, I love it. And the equally glorious and beautiful Rob Rice.
Good to see you, dear. Hello, my name is Dr. Rob S. Rice. I'm a historian, a military historian, and sociological and technological historian. I've actually published on the Victorian age. I also write historical fantasy where I go to great lengths not to disturb the timeline, but I'm very familiar with the idea of alternate Britons and different ways of looking at the history of England. And I'm looking forward very much to giving you what I can give you as part of this panel.
Terrific. And the equally glorious and marvelous Erica Frensley.
Hi, I'm Erica Frensley. I'm probably representing the Fanish side of this panel. I have a degree in history and interests in English history, interests in alternate histories. Sorry,
Marvelous.
a little disconcerting there.
That's all right. That is perfectly all right. Well, thank you all for joining me. I am Danita Feldman. I'm a professional storyteller and life coach, and I have a British accent. So that, I guess, qualifies me to be on this panel and to moderate it for the greatness of all mankind. So my first question is, why do alternate Britons remain so popular? Let's go around. Rob.
Well, Britain was such a tiny little island and on this huge, vast world, and yet, for some reason or other, the sun never set on the British Empire. It influenced more thousands and millions of thousands of people throughout the world, and exerted such a disproportionate influence on all the world's culture. I mean, really, everybody is either reacting to Britain in some manner, way, shape, or fashion. To a lesser extent, that's going on now with the United States, but for England, it was started very early. The whole world knew of England very early on. The French were fascinated with the tale of King Arthur. The ransom of King Richard I was the talk of the world. It was a fascinating this little tiny island. It was such a huge pivot point for so many of the world's events. So if you want to change a great deal besides Britain, just tweak Britain a little bit and the rest of the world changes along with it. It's a central focus point of so much of the world's culture and events.
Very cool. Erica, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think we're dealing with a little bit of myopia because so much, coming from the US, so much of our culture is from Great Britain. Really, we didn't start to diverge until the mid 1800s from the culture of Great Britain. And yes, Great Britain has had such a huge impact on the world events, but it's essentially the great empire that has so many possible change points. So much culture that we understand and we want to play with.
Cool. And Carrie?
Yeah, having traveled quite a bit, to certain parts of the world, I had the thought once that, an alien civilization coming to Earth without any context would decide that Queen Victoria was the most important person who ever lived, just because there's statues of her everywhere. Every Caribbean island that had been a colony of the British Empire has a statue of Queen Victoria. You go to Australia, there are statues of Queen Victoria. You know, they're somehow, you know, as Rob said, you know, the influence of the British Empire is global, which from a story standpoint has, you know, offers a huge amount of opportunity as well, you know, for better or for worse. And I think a lot of people, you know, fall on either side of that divide for better or for worse. Yeah, there's a lot of stories out there, and the empire had a pretty big impact through the colonial empire. And there's just so much to play with in that playground.
Nice. So does it seem that a few time periods get all the focus, like the Regency and the Victorian era? That seems to be a lot of the stories are based in those time periods. Does it seem that way to you? Carrie, let's start with you.
It does a little bit, and the answer is because that's where most of the literature that is most popular comes from. If you look at Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, you know, pretty much everybody gets exposed to their writing at some point in school, so those end up being a familiar entry point that, you know, you can talk about. Or Sherlock Holmes, you know, that's another one. You know, the Victorian period was many decades long, so there's a lot of literature that falls in there. So that's what I've, you know, looking at that question, you know, before the panel, you know, why do certain, you know, certain periods get more attention than others? It's the literature. We all know about Jane Austen. We all know about Charles Dickens. Shakespeare is the other one. I think, you know, the Elizabethan period because of Shakespeare, you know, and then a couple of other things here and there, but there's sort of these great wide swaths, like the late 17th century or like the mid 18th century, you know, the sort of pre-American Revolutionary era that just don't get as much attention because we just don't get exposed to it in the literature as much. That's my sort of simplistic answer of why that happens.
Nice.
On to the rest of you.
Oh, yes. Erica, thoughts?
Well, a lot of it is what Carrie said. It's a familiarity. And for those of us in the States, there's a couple of different touch points that we're taught in our normal history classes. Not so much into the in-depth military history that Rob gets to learn and teach about, but in our basic ones. War of Independence, the Elizabethan, Shakespeare, World War II, of course, Queen Victoria. It's like it goes from Napoleon to Queen Victoria, forgetting that there's a generation between the two. And so it's the touch points that people are just familiar with. And then you've got the genres of literature, you know, Regency romance, Jane Austen, expanding it into the Regency romance. So I think that's why you end up with it getting clotted into some of these touch points.
Nice. Rob?
I like the developing connection between the interest and the media. Shakespeare is such a magnificent medium, all the art and the plays, and everybody's fascinated with that period. Robin Hood and the songs of Robin Hood make people interested in that period of time. Dickens, Sherlock Holmes, all the other wonderful, we forget there are the other things Arthur Conan Doyle wrote, fast to draw our attentions there. But the thing was, there were a lot of places where just a slight change in the British history could have changed the entire timeline for all the world. There's one novel, I don't remember the title of it, which involves that the white ship doesn't sink. Henry I's entire family, except for one woman, don't go down with the ship. And that completely alters the whole flow, the entire subsequent flow of world timeline. Or what if James II had decided to stand his ground and fight it out because he had a good chance of winning, but instead he runs and the glorious revolution takes place and Britain changes forever afterward. So there's certainly plenty of divergent points that you could pick on and seize upon, but we do tend to go with the media is because that's we know people are interested in it. Sherlock Holmes is still a thing. Arthur Conan Doyle is still a thing. Charles Dickens is still a thing. I want to sell books and eat food. Therefore, around like bees with a saucer of honey left outside in the sun. So you go where people are interested in. If I were to write a long period of time on, say, the levelers revolution in the 1200s, people would be yawning their heads off. But on the other hand, if I talk about Richard II and Shakespeare, I'm doing a lot better than I would if I used that particular revolution.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you've got a point that people are more familiar with them, but wouldn't that suggest a jumping point to do something a little bit off the beaten track? I mean, for example, Blackadder, where the princes in the tower don't actually die and Richard IV becomes the king.
Well, exactly the point. There's also, the nice part is there's much, as Carrie will tell you, there's lots and lots of other divergent points you could jump on and make a whole story, a whole series, a whole world out of, just by changing one little thing there and following the dice as they flow down. It's fascinating and fun to do. The possibilities are always immense. What if the British had actually attacked during the Civil War? Harry Turtledove got something like 25 books out of all that. And Robert Conroy did his own alternate Civil War history with the British intervening and attacking the wrong side. So the Confederates and the Union both turned upon them. It was a really ridiculous, reunited the country against the British, which was terribly funny, but somewhat believable. So the point is, it's a very fertile field. People have gone where they know there's an audience. Sherlock Holmes fighting German agents who were getting ready for the World War I, or the Riddle of the Sands coming true, that sort of thing. People have gone where they think people are going to be interested. If you can do the other stuff, well, you've done very well, but you'll have to find a readership for it. Now, some of them have, some of them haven't.
Yeah. To kind of build on that, the part of the attraction of alternate history is the thrill of recognizing the difference. So in order to get that from your audience has to know what the difference is. So you do have to, well, you don't have to, and I think there is, there is, a lot of material to be had in the more, I don't want to call them obscure, but these not as well known areas of history, but you'd have to explain to your reader what the change is, versus, the Civil War. We all can understand the changes there. My favorite turning point that I would love to do more with is, what if Arthur Tudor had lived, Henry VIII's older brother, who married Catherine of Aragon and then immediately died and set off this entire domino effect, for the next 50 years. But what if he didn't die? What if we had King Arthur Tudor? But anyway, a lot of people don't, they know about Henry VIII and they know about the 6 wives and they know about all that, but they don't know that Henry VIII had an older brother named Arthur who died young. And what if? But, it's easier to not have to explain that, and your audience gets that thrill, if they don't know the more obscure, parts of history.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because my mum and I have just been watching The Spanish Princess by Philippa Gregory, and they do pursue the story of Prince Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And as a historian myself, an amateur historian, something that I find very interesting is where they know the history, but they've bent it to their own will and confused people. I remember coming out of the movie with Cate Blanchett about Elizabeth I and talking to these young women who thought that that was actual history, and then having to explain to them that, no, it wasn't. And where do you blend that line? I mean, you can jump off into, this is an alternate universe. We've got steampunk, we've got airships, we've got Queen Elizabeth solving mysteries and those sorts of things, and just, very much making it a powerful, this is a different thing, to the very subtle, we know that Arthur was 14 years old when he married Catherine of Aragon, but we're going to portray him as an adult.
He was very close to it in that period of time.
14. He was close. Yeah, he was closer, but still.
It doesn't look right to a modern audience. And I think you do have to take your audience into account as to what's. Oh, yeah. My hope is always that I don't necessarily need to be historically accurate in every little thing. The hope is your audience is going to go in and investigate the history, because I love Elizabeth, the Cate Blanchett movie, and part of the confusion with it is it takes about 10 years of history and condenses it into it looks like it's taking place over like a week, and you're like, no, actually a lot of this stuff happened over the course of a decade. But that would make for a very boring movie. It wouldn't necessarily be a story that people are interested in. So for me, that's the balance. It's like I can get them interested in, and then the hope is that people will go and investigate more of this on their own.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Were you saying something, Rob? Oh, go on.
I'm sorry, Rob. Did I step on you?
Okay.
when you were talking about, changing the history and bringing in steampunk, some time ago, my friends in the pre-pandemic stage were watching a movie. And it was rather interesting, rather fun. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter.
That movie. I love that movie.
It was wonderful. They brought in actually a lot of tidbits of history that normally people don't learn about, in the normal history classes. But she, being a history teacher, was saying, "Oh, they bring in this guy really now? How historical is this?" As I had to tell her, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter may be a clue. When you bring in steampunk, new types of magic, a jumping off point, I don't think you need to slavishly stick to the absolute history because you're already breaking it. I don't think that you can go free reign and go, oh, guess what? Just because Queen Victoria was assassinated, we're all living in magic and everyone's bewitched, because that makes no sense. There has to be a logical historical trail, but I don't think we need to be quite so concerned with a lot of history unless you're trying to write that type of alternate history book, which Rob is definitely more qualified than I ever will be to even attempt.
I'm not asserting my qualifications, but I'm telling you this about the thing. Who are you writing for? If you're writing for people who want an adventure story, then you might want to write about some of Elizabeth's lovers or some of the great generals of the time. If you're writing a story for history geeks, then you do what I do, which is to have all these things taking place behind the scenes without disturbing the time flow at all. I have Benjamin Disraeli out of power, collaborating with Americans who are frantically trying to keep the British from intervening in the Civil War. And it's a lot of fun to do it, but it's much, much harder because I actually have to pay attention to what the actual historical events were. But on the other hand, it really helps you lay things out because you're fettered to things that actually happen. You can't really go too far astray because otherwise you'll start not making any sense at all. I can't have an airship flying over 1860s London. There wasn't one. There were accounts of ones, there were rumors of one, but there never was one. But for example, just think of the fun for a history geek. If you're reading this novel of the 1930s in Britain, and the R-101 comes back from its triumphant voyage to India.
Oh, wow.
It was this incredibly huge and complicated airship that piled into a French mountainside because the people on board would not admit they had made about every engineering error in the book. They died rather than actually admit they built a horrible machine. What if it had made it? A little tweak, suddenly the history geeks are all your friends. Now they're going to turn on you. I was talking to Eric Flint last year at Cosine. Hello, Am. And he said, the thing was, you go pick an area where the history geeks won't mob you and hate you for changing the slightest possible thing, because it's much easier to write and the audience is much more good-natured. But if you're tough enough to write to please the history geeks, then you can live in obscurity and starvation like I'm doing, and nobody reads my books.
Sorry, who are you?
Right, I'm not that I'm bitter or anything. But on the other hand, it's nice to have a structure. It's nice to have a structure. How do I make this all work out with Britain not getting into the war? And that's a lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah, I think there's a lot of fertile ground out there if you can find a way, to take some of these more obscure. So I released a couple of Robin Hood related novellas this year. Robin Hood, quintessential British hero, who's very hard to write about because he's so ahistorical. There are so many different stories about him set in so many different time periods that if you want to do it historically and not totally fantastically, you have to pick, and then you have to explore the implications of that. And so my stories are about Robin Hood's children, which had the great benefit of once I started digging into that history and taking the Errol Flynn movie as kind of my base point and what would happen after that. And it turns out his kids would be teenagers at about the same time as King John's heir would be a teenager. So King John dies. His son, who becomes Henry III, is 9 years old, and has a very long regency period. And at that point, I don't have to change the history, and I still get this sort of fabulous kind of YA adventure story with Robin Hood's children and King Henry III solving crime and having adventures in early 13th century England, which is not a period that gets covered at all, really.
So why do we like the idea of saving the lives of historical royals who died young or just dropped into obscurity? You know, what if
or killing off ones that maybe should have been.
Yes, yes. What's the interest in doing that? Erica, let's hear from you.
Well, I think the interest is, royalty, especially in Great Britain, has always had a huge influence. And again, it's kind of our cultural myopia. We're familiar with Great Britain. We went to Spain last year, and we were reading about Queen Joanna, who went mad over grief. Some gorgeous Goya paintings, I tell you. But that's not something that we really know about. We know about Henry VIII and his little wandering proclivities. We think we know about Queen Victoria. We think we know about the Prince Regent, Queen Elizabeth I, etc. But because we've built such a personality around them. And once you have that, they start becoming characters almost akin to like Superman, Robin Hood, and you can do so much with them. And generally the times that they're in are really fascinating as well. So you can take advantage of the times, of the people, and of the environment and the world around them.
I like that. Rob?
Well, think about Robin Hood itself. I mean, it's a series. It's a whole oeuvre of period work at the same period of time. Every time they had a good story or a good ballad about an archer or about someone who, like Adam Bell, another archer who walked through it was about the same time and had a very different set of adventures, people would fold them into the Robin Hood. Or, oh, that's a good story, but let's make it Robin Hood so people will listen. So it's a very old phenomenon going on to this day. And even Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story called Peace Correspondence, which I mentioned in one of my novels, where someone is imagining what if this person hadn't died. It wasn't just royalty. It'd be people like Gladstone or some of the other leaders of the time. What if this person had lived and this person had died and so forth? And you could go back and forth and just flip a few switches and the whole world would change again. There's you want to keep your audience, but you want to take them someplace they haven't been before. And it's much easier to have your sudden divergent point at that point and go on to your own new world there, because at that point you get to make up a lot more stuff. And that's the easier part. The researching and trying to keep close to the narrative is very hard and slow work. And it's not terribly exciting, I guess, because people don't seem to find it terribly interesting in my own work. I'm coping, but it could be marketing, could be other things. But I've done very hard to keep the timelines intact. I'm very well reviewed, but I'm not well read.
So do we differentiate between fictionalizing real monarchs who lived or creating a completely new monarch like King Ralph?
Oh. So I'm gonna do another plug for another set of writing I'm associated with, which is the Wildcard series. And over the last couple of years, we decided we wanted to cover what the wildcard world was like in Britain, which is something we hadn't really done. You know, we had a few British characters. And just to give the thumbnail summary of this, Wildcards is a shared world series of novels edited by George R.R. Martin about a world in which superheroes exist. You know, they appear right after World War II, and it changes everything. It absolutely changes everything. And the alternate history in Britain has diverged wildly, you know, to risk using that, you know, the term wild, in that almost the entire last half of the 20th century, the monarchy is completely different. You know, there is no Queen Elizabeth II. You know, things are, because of, you know, the virus that changed everything after World War II. You know, it impacted Britain, and I still haven't read the book that just came out, so I don't even know all of the ripples that are coming out of that. But, you know, once again, for better or for worse, it's we know British history via the monarchs. You know, we call it the Victorian period. We don't call it, you know, the height of the 19th century British Empire. You know, we call it the Victorian. We call it the Edwardian, the Georgian. You know, the Elizabethan, the Jacobean. You know, all of the history is arranged around the monarchs, and so it's a very easy way to kind of give entrance to an alternate history. You know, whether you change the monarchy, you adjust it, there's a different monarch, there's the same monarch, but something changed. Like initially you would think, well, if Arthur Tudor had lived, then the Protestant Reformation wouldn't have come to England. But that's not quite right, because, the Protestant Reformation was already on its way to England, before Henry VIII became king. And so, the Reformation impulse was there, but it would have gone a whole lot differently without the whole marriage question of Henry VIII. So how would it have gone? What would Britain look like with no Queen Elizabeth? Because, without Henry VIII, you don't have Queen Elizabeth. So it's like there's two different ways of doing it. There's sort of the upper level of history, the big sweeps of the Elizabethan period or whatever, but there's also these little details of what's actually going on under the surface. The monarchs are symbolic and representative, but there's all of these other things going on in the surface. And I think the really good alternate histories look at that and teach us something we maybe didn't know before. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I like that. I could talk about this stuff all day, because that's a time period I'm very interested in as well. But no, absolutely. But when you create a completely different timeline, if say all of the heirs to the British throne got wiped out, say in the pandemic, then then what?
If I may, one of the things we are always looking for as authors and looking for as historians are characters, people who have fascinating stories, fascinating histories, fascinating characters. They do interesting and spectacular things. I used Richard Burton as one of my semi-villains in one of my stories. The more I learned about him, the more I realized there was to learn about him.
You mean the explorer, not the actor, I presume?
The fellow from whom the actor took his name. How could I badmouth the fellow Welshman? Anyway, these fascinating. If you go too far away from the timeline, you lose all these fascinating characters. Talking about Arthur means you get to talk about Henry and Henry VII, the old man himself, who was quite the character. Really, my lords of Ireland, you'll be crowning apes next. After the last batch of pretenders got shipped through the latest discoveries of princes in the Tower. So you don't want to lose your characters. You want to keep them if you possibly can. I thought Sourdough Jackson's I forget what her name is now. Sourdough Jackson's book, Torpedo Junction.
Jean.
Jean. I want to be nice to Sourdough, she's a sweetie. But anyway, Torpedo Junction, he shuffled the history deck wildly. Nimitz is now von Nimitz. Erwin Rommel is a U.S. admiral, and the British are actually holding Singapore and Hong Kong. They're actually winning in that one. But he kept the characters, he shuffled the deck. That is where you can have a lot of fun, because you can say, how would Edward III have coped with a French airship fleet? How would that man deal with that? And you start getting into the guy's head. In one of my novels, Henry V is actually reincarnated, comes back in the form of a person living in the 1860s. He's going to lead the invasion of the United States. And how would he deal with it? Well, the thing is, he was out of his mind. He had no idea who these people were. He didn't know what he was doing there. He was trying to understand things, and he was being a pawn of other forces. You use the characters. You can use some of the events, but once you change the timeline, you just don't get quite the same thing. On the other hand, like the biological stuff, the plague is going to hit. I'm just downloaded The Journey of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. I'm really looking forward to reading it, although it may seem too much like today.
I hear it's a comedy.
1532. So but characters, events, and things that people recognize are necessary to make the story work. It's like a chessboard. The pieces can go any which way, but the pieces themselves never change.
What about introducing magic? That seems to be a very popular trope. And where does it work really well? Where doesn't it work as well? And, and again, the books that I've read, like Sorcery and Cecilia, and where they bring Discovery of Witches, where they bring magic into the mix in these realms. So they keep the history more or less the same, but they add in the magic element. How does that spice things up? Carrie?
I think in some ways, it can sort of highlight some of the social issues of the period. I'm thinking of Mary Robinette Cole's Shades of Milk and Honey, which is set in a regency with magic, and it becomes another element of kind of the social interaction, the very rigid social interaction of the day, and class issues. C.L. Polk's Witchmark is another one that I'm thinking of, which is technically not Britain, but it's a very Edwardian looking Britain, or a very Edwardian looking fantasy world. in which magic is also used to kind of highlight class issues and class differences. So that's where I've seen it work well. Also, something like the Elizabethan era where witchcraft was considered to be a real actual thing. So writing a story set there, you can just make it a real actual thing. And what does that look like? And I've seen many authors use, it's John Dee, isn't it? The sort of alchemical dude of that era. I knew it was Dee. Wasn't sure I was getting the first name right. But that's a very, very popular subject, is you get, the very kind of the nascent roots of science. The alchemists were the first chemists, and taking that angle as well is that this was a period where magic and science were exactly the same things in some ways. Exploring one was considered exploring, there was no science, there was just magic that eventually became science because people started writing it down. And that's a very fruitful area of exploration, I think, as well.
One thing you might want to remember is that the Elizabethans did magic in their own world. For example, the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, The Sorcerer, which is one of the funniest things and most brilliant integrations of magic into society you've ever seen. We always were having a discount sale, but I can't do it this week because we're doing inventory. One of those that's all Gilbert and Sullivan, hilariously done. And then, of course, think of Dracula. I mean, this guy turns into a dog, and he sleeps in a coffin. He's bringing in his wives. He's going to infect England with vampirism. And that's a perfectly normal society with this horrible, suddenly supernatural force coming into it. They did it too. So there's no certainly shame in doing it. The catch is you always have to watch out that you don't end up with a wizard did it. You write yourself into some impossible hole and a wizard did it. It's all fixed and everything's worked out just fine. Deus ex machina or Deus machina ending. And that's where if magic becomes too much of a crutch or becomes the end all of what you're writing, why bother with the history? Go straight for full fantasy, like the Golden Coils, Silver Scales and Golden Coils series Rowena wrote about the giants in this parallel fantasy world. Ditch history and just go your own way. If you're going to work with history, you can't suddenly have someone just wave a wand and the Spanish Armada sinks.
Well, and that's a problem I've got with Harry Potter, is that if you've got such a well-developed wizard world with so many great effects and great powers, it's going to affect the Muggle world, unless you're talking about a very inbred, insular universe, which somehow affects everything, but yet nothing of any interest to us. And at that point, I keep looking at it, there's so many fantasies like that, like Harry Potter, but which do impinge on it. I love the Diana Wynne Jones fantasy in England, because she does actually look at it a bit. What can they do? What can they not do? How much effect can they have? I mean, in Harry Potter, you've got a world that has an entirely different financial system that coexists alongside the mundane real world. And there's no bleed over, no effect. No one's saying, hey, what's this cool gold coin on the ground? I like this. I'm suddenly rich. And someone's going, oh, crap, I dropped a galleon,
That would cause problems. I was watching the panel earlier about the price of magic, and the point was made that the magic should be like science in a story, that it's not about the magic, it's about the characters, it's about the story, and that magic is just an element of it, that it's not about the magic. But you made me think about when Rob was saying about waving a wand and sinking the Armada. If I read Catherine Kurtz's Lammas Night, which it takes place during World War II, but it centers around these people who are a coven, and they talk about Francis Drake having been part of the whole effort and actually using magic to help affect all of that. But it was done in a subtle way that you could almost believe that this actually had an impact. You could see old Francis standing up there, playing bowls when he was told that the Armada was sighted, and he was playing bowls.
Yeah, you talk to some people that there might have been something going on that helped to sink the Spanish Armada. Depending on who you talk to. Just putting that out there, and during the Battle of Britain in World War II.
You know who did a
as
good
well.
job of integrating magic into British history, and he did it after World War II, was C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. Merlin is sleeping under this quiet, boring British university. He's being dug up by people who think he's going to work on the side of evil, and he turns on them with a rather horrifying ferocity. And basically, the interstellar good guys nuke the town. It's literally Edgetown is destroyed at pretty much a nuclear blast. And he just, well, that's the Edgetown disaster. Moving on. And it was fascinating how well that worked. He didn't pull his punches at all. He was really being quite cataclysmic and spectacular. But at the same time, he just said nobody, once the disaster had occurred, they spent more time recovering from it than trying to figure out exactly how it had happened or why it had happened. It's a really wonderful book, and he fits it all together so terribly well. It's not very well read. The Space Trilogy is kind of forgotten these days, but That Hideous Strength is one of the all-time great magic and English society books you'll ever read.
So how do you balance it out? When can it go really badly wrong?
I'm trying to think of a bad.
Well, I think what Rob was saying is it's your characters. I think Rob and Erica were both saying it's about the characters. It has to be about the characters. If you get to a point where it's all about, you know, the magic or this mechanism of whatever, you know, whatever your gimmick is, you know, whatever thing that you're using to change history, if it becomes all about that and the characters are just kind of MacGuffins or, you know, placeholders to just have all this other stuff happening, I think it needs to come out of the characters. And I think that's where things tend to go wrong. If the changes aren't coming from the decisions and the actions of the characters, but instead being imposed from outside, then it's just not going to be as engaging.
The hand moving the chess pieces becomes too visible. You're moving things around all the time. You're not actually playing a game. You're just moving things.
Well, it becomes a puzzle, like the whole history. I think,
Yeah.
you know, there's a danger that the alternate history can just become kind of a, you know, moving the gears around, and it becomes this kind of mechanical exercise rather than being about the story.
Turtle Devil does that.
I have to say that one of my favorite alternate history movies, you know, in the recent years has been, believe it or not, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies.
Not. I thought it was a great idea.
Not only was the book a great idea, but I really loved how the movie said, okay, now let's look at this. You have a zombie invasion. How does it affect the power structure in England? And while keeping it framed in the Jane Austen Pride and Prejudice, you suddenly realize that this is like one of the last holdouts of old traditional Britain. And they're not going to make it. And just the way that the movie especially went through and went, okay, let's look at how this happens. Let's look at the power structure. Let's look at everything fracturing, which is what would happen. And then you see, you know, our heroes, heroines, as kind of a sequestered little enclave that is doing their best, but their days are numbered.
But that's character study. How do you cope with the end of the world?
Mm-hmm.
So is the Prince Regent a zombie at this point?
I think that's the.
I haven't read it. I don't know.
Quite frankly, if he's not a zombie, he's probably suffering some syphilis, so he's pretty much out of the power structure.
He was anyway.
Yeah.
Now there seems to be a fascination with writing queens more often in a lot of these alternates, and I don't know if it's just because of the time periods that tend to get chosen, but are the queens inherently more interesting, even if they're, you know, quote unquote secondary characters like Henry VIII's wives? Although I think them all perfectly fascinating on their own. So.
Well,
sorry, Carrie, go on.
Oh, here's the really interesting thing for me about English history is it's super patriarchal.
Yep.
You know, very, you know, women should do X, and men should do Y. And, you know, especially I've been listening to a podcast about the Tudor era and reading Hilary Mantel's novels about Thomas Cromwell. And, you know, there's discussion is that women just aren't capable of this, and women just shouldn't do this. And meanwhile, there's, you know, Anne Boleyn is just got her fingers in everything, just arranging and conniving and using what power she has. And the men around her kind of going, what what is she doing? Like, women aren't supposed to be doing this. So you've got this very patriarchal society, and the two best known monarchs in England are the queens. Victoria and Elizabeth I ruled for decades. They defined their eras. They bucked tradition in so many ways, and like on paper, like according to that society, they should not have been possible, and yet they were, and they oversaw two of kind of the most important periods in English history in some ways. So yeah, they're inherently fascinating because they should not have existed. Like if you just look at the power structures in the society, and yet here they are. So they almost seem like alternate history themselves in some ways. No other country has, except for maybe Catherine the Great, has that sort of profound impact of women monarchs. So yeah, they're inherently fascinating, just as, and the kind of people that they each had to be to have the kind of impact that they had. Yeah, that's my take on it. I'm just fascinated with both of them because they shouldn't have existed, really.
Well, one of the things with a lot of the British history and culture, while officially it was very separated out, Richard and then Eleanor of Aquitaine, who just quietly behind the scenes arranges things to the way she wants it.
Not so quietly.
The thing is that when you have a structure that you kind of zone the power that the genders have, you're going to find a lot of women working within that zone to a point that leaves us in awe today. What Anne Boleyn was going through, it was like, man, she could have given Hillary Clinton lessons. I mean, because her life depended upon it. Her family, her money, her life depended on her playing the game. And so what you really have is essentially with Victoria and Elizabeth I, especially Elizabeth I, playing the game and going, screw this, I'm winning. And I've been playing the game since I was a youngster and locked away and ignored. And I know how to do it, and you men don't.
I've always thought the great Elizabeth I moment is when one of the courtiers said, "You must do this, Your Majesty." She said, little man, there is no must for princes." One of her great lines. But the other thing is, you forget that it's the pinnacle of feminine empowerment. I got news for you, genitalia whatsoever. I'm in charge now, and I'm going to stay there. We forget, for example, Henry VI's horrible wife, Margaret of Anjou, who was quite willing to dispose of him once she had a son by him, because she could control the son much more easily than she could control the semi-insane father. We forget about Maud/Matilda, who got thrown off the throne by King Stephen, put back on the throne by King Stephen, put her off the throne by King Stephen, and finally was settled for making a deal. Okay, I'll leave, but my kid gets to be king. Deal. We also have Queen Anne, who married a non-entity, a nice little German prince who made ship models and was otherwise harmless. And she was it for quite some time, at a very pivotal moment when the Catholics were making one big last effort to retake over England again. And then what about Queen Mary, who went along with it? Okay, I get to marry a Dutchman. What does that mean? Donuts. Good enough. So England had a lot of other female
herring. Lots and lots of herring.
How many Americans know about Edith Wilson? Woodrow Wilson's wife, who basically used him as a ventriloquist dummy for the last 2 years of his presidency. And she was a horrible racist, a very vicious person who, by trying to ruin things herself, actually kept the Democrats' vice president from succeeding to the presidency, and he would have been able to run as an incumbent against Harding. But the thing is, if you get the shovel out and start digging under the rock, you'll find some amazing things if you're willing to work with them. And that's one of the things I respected Flint so much for doing when he was the guest of honor. He was with our convention 2 years ago, and then he was at CoSign last year. Is that he just took what he was given and was able to find so much that he could work with and work so well with that he's created a whole new branching bit of historical alternate history fiction.
Nice. So there's a whole realm of untouched monarchs that, either they were British colonies or the Dutch royal family, the Spanish royal family, the Swedish and Norwegian royal families. And if you watch the Hallmark Channel, there's all these little tiny principalities that all have royals, which all, for some mad reason, all speak with perfect British accents, which I can never understand. But
they all fall in love with plucky young American girls.
And their mothers always disappear. We got the Princess Diaries. We've got Princess Mia Thermopolis, who's the granddaughter of Julie Andrews. So they go and sing together. But just to wrap it up, what royal do you think has been left out that you would love to tackle in an alternative way? Let's go round, Carrie.
Oh, I don't know about alternative. I need to think about that. Just the Tudor era is kind of my favorite era, partly because it does have so many of these little touchdowns, and so many times where it could have gone awry. And part of that is as Rob mentioned, Henry VII was very interesting, and he was a bit of a usurper, and so there was this air of illegitimacy to the entire Tudor era, according to some of the contemporaries.
Oh yeah.
So that's fascinating, just because there's a million places it could have changed. So that's one area I would like to tackle. I've really enjoyed writing about Henry III. There's not really anything alternate that I want to do with him except having him be friends with Robin Hood's children, which I think is just a huge amount of fun that I'm having fun with. But it's required me to really study Henry III, who is kind of obscure. He's the first British monarch to reign for more than 50 years, because he was crowned so young. So he was there for a really long time, and he actually had a really big impact politically, because he was kind of a bad king, like kind of wretchedly awful in some ways, which is too bad, because by every single account and every historian, he seems to have been a really nice guy. Like he doesn't have any recorded children out of wedlock, which is really unusual for British kings. So I'm just fascinated that he's really interesting. He was a really terrible king. And it turns out he had a really big impact, because he was so bad that they had to invent Parliament, basically.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm having a great time there. So what if he had been a good king? I mean,
that's interesting. I mean, it's like Richard III. Everybody has this image of Richard III, which was created by Shakespeare pandering to Henry VIII. But you read the history, and he was a very good king. He was a good general. He did a lot of good things for the country, but history paints him in that particular way. So it's a similar kind of a story. That's really cool. So Erica.
Well, I'm actually, even though the rulers are kind of the touch points, I'm more interested in the era. And I've been very slowly working on a story which is reaching into decades now. And it's set in 1836. And so I started studying the period between 1815 and 1837, when Victoria took the throne. And there was so much change going on that it is absolutely incredible that people just skip over. You had slavery officially being abolished after the transport of slaves was abolished earlier, but slavery being officially abolished in 1832, which is a great touch point for an alternate history. You've got the changes in the criminal acts and the crime and punishment acts that lessened the number of offenses that people could be put to death from over 20 to about 4. The growth in London doubled in population during that period, and all of the stresses in London and the towns surrounding it. There's just so much going on. We went to Cambridge University, and on one of the doors was gouged out, no peelers. People didn't like police. They didn't like the idea of cops. And just thinking about all of the implications of that. So I'm more on the lower level rather than the regents, but that is just such a fascinating period.
Mm-hmm. And what if Princess Charlotte hadn't died?
What if Princess Charlotte hadn't died? What if King William had been a little bit of a stronger king?
Mm-hmm.
What if George hadn't been George? It's about the best way to put that one.
George had daddy issues. That was his problem.
Wellington. What if some of his decisions had gone differently? This was the last holdout of the East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
What if some of their decisions and those circumstances had gone differently? So I recommend people take a peek at that era if they're looking for something and just take off from it, because there's a whole lot there.
Terrific. All right, Rob.
Edward VI. He was a decent kid. He had a good heart. He'd just pardoned. The first thing he did was to pardon a man his father had sentenced to be executed, the Duke of Buckingham. He did not want a religious war. He was a strong Protestant, but he said in his will, if I make Mary Queen of England, she's going to burn people alive. Well, they all took the side of that will, and Mary became Queen of England, and she burned people alive. He was a decent kid. He was actually quite healthy. He was athletic. He was not sickly. He was not particularly inbred. He was a smart. We've got his journals that show this decent, kindly, sensitive soul. Imagine having a thoroughly good human being running England at the same time, right after Henry VIII had done it. Someone who didn't have to force a fight, wasn't always playing other factions off against each other. A popular, like Richard II when he was young. A young monarch like that would have been a tremendous asset for England. There would have been peace. There would have been prosperity. He could have gone back to the policies of his grandfather, Henry VII, who was a very good king for all the fact he was a usurper. Things would have gone so much better if he'd lived. I always read about his death, and it breaks me up every time. And who else wrote an alternate history about that period? Mark Twain. Mark Twain made Edward VI live again, and he did a very good job of it.
Yeah. Very cool.
One thing very quickly.
Yes, please.
Think about all the science fiction books that are now alternate history. 1984 is now alternate history. War of the Worlds is now alternate history. That area has come and gone. So now it's a whole different, it's like another universe. Airstrip 1 Britain is existing over in some pocket of reality. You'll excuse me for a minute. I'm afraid I've held out as long as I possibly can, but I've got to make a quick pit stop.
We're very, very nearly done. And one might say that 1984 was predictive, but who am I to say that?
At this point, are we in the alternate history of 1984, or is 1984 depicting a future alternate history?
That's a very good question. But it's interesting to me because when I was researching for this, I found that people have been writing alternate histories, and you can date it back. I mean, you talk about the Robin Hood legends, the King Arthur legends. Mary Shelley wrote an alternate history. We've got alternate histories going back as far as men have been writing stories. So what's the fascination?
It's what if. It's the what if something had been different? What if it had gone this way and not that way? I think as long as there's been the study of history, those questions have been a part of it. So yeah, it'd be interesting to go all the way back to Herodotus, the Greek who is credited with inventing the study of history. That it's just people want to know what if.
One of the most marvelous poems I ever read was written by Ogden Nash, and it was Abraham Lincoln talking to a famous actor who'd come to visit him in 1866. Reconstruction was going very well. People were getting along. The blacks were being properly taken care of. Things were really healing. And Lincoln was saying, well, that's so wonderful. And he was telling him of his travels for the country, the theater audiences he performed before, and how beautiful everything was. And Lincoln said, well, that's truly wonderful. To hear this from the greatest actor of our age. And Edwin Booth said, no, I had a brother, John, but he died of a fever in 1863. And you're just going, that is alternate history at its very best. It makes you want to just weep and weep and weep and cheer because that son of a. it was in a poem, absolutely gorgeous poem by Ogden Nash, and I've always thought that's one of the greatest attractions of alternate history. What if we dodged all the hell? What if Archduke Ferdinand hadn't been shot? What if things had not gone so horribly, horribly wrong? Because then it would be a happy story, and those are not always unpopular. You can write a happy story and have people read it sometimes. If things get good, that's also works.
But that's the study of history is determining what those points are. Where did things change? Why did they change? What do those forks in the road look like? We don't necessarily see the forks in the road while we're traveling them, but you can look back and they become much clearer then.
It was one
and
of
the writers of the history make the history, like Richard III.
I did want to mention one other book if I can, and I'll do it
Please.
quickly. Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court.
Of course.
Oh, yeah.
Back in time, he has electric fences and knights electrocuting themselves onto the steamships in the 1200s. And it's just absolutely brazen. Mark Twain, it's a really quite depressing and grim and unpleasant book. I read it all the way through and I'm thinking, I now know why they only made the movie out about the first 1/3 of it. It's really a depressing and grim book. But that's one of the earliest examples of alternate history, alternate Britain, and it was just utterly fascinating. And Twain did
they also had to make it so Bing Crosby could sing.
Bingo. So it's a really fascinating book if you want to read an old, really weird take on the whole thing. And it's Mark Twain, folks, so the prose is going to be
Mark
good.
Twain had an ingenious mind.
Absolutely. The other part is that when you're making stories and thinking about what if, and you've got a lot of the rulers, a lot of the kings, queens, the large figures, having been made into folklore figures,
Yes.
like Robin Hood, well, then you can take off. Then you can go, what if this weird folklore figure that kept marrying women and killing them wasn't a king? What if one of his wives killed him? So there's a little bit of that folkloric with and what if things went different?
Yeah. No, I like it. Final thoughts from each of you. Rob.
As a historian, I write serious nonfiction history, things that people actually buy to read because they want to read nonfiction. I am grateful for any interest at all. So if the story makes people think, I want to really know what kind of person was Gladstone? What kind of person was Benjamin Disraeli? I'll take that as a win. Please write the stuff. Don't worry about me coming and denouncing you with thunderbolts and lightning storms. I like people having a good time. I like people reading a good story. I like people being entertained. I'm all for it. I just hope it's well done and that I'll enjoy it when I read it. If I get mad and upset about it, well, that's one copy that you won't sell again, but everybody else might be happy. Please go back to history. It's a fascinating place. I have a motto. History is the very expensive gift the past gives to the present.
Nice. Erica.
Alternate history gives us a chance to see what would have been. And especially when you do some hard studying in there, there's a wonderful book called The Great Upheaval, talking about the trail of the American Revolution leading to the French Revolution, leading to not quite the Russian Revolution, but changes in Russia, and seeing the same people going from the American Revolution to the French Revolution to Russia really makes an impact of how much one person can have on history of the world.
Nice. And Carrie, take us home, baby.
I'm going to do the sales plug. I'm going to be your commercial voice. So the Book Bar here in Denver has signed book plates for many of the participants here at MileHiCon. So if you feel the urge to order some books from them, I know they've got a link up at the MileHiCon website. You will get a signed book plate to go with any books that you order from the authors that they have book plates for. And the list is up there. So I encourage you, there's so many good books out there and so many great authors here at MileHiCon. So please support them and support Book Bar for carrying our books. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you all for a fascinating discussion. Stay well, keep reading, keep writing, and have lots and lots and lots of fun.
Thank you for moderating.
What is this myth?
Our cups to you.
Long live the Queen.